Hi, I'm Hawa. I have an essay in a collection called Becoming Meta.
My name is Julie Holland, and my chapter is called Ambition. I'm Sarah Ruhl, and I don't really remember my title, but I think it was a letter to my mother and my daughters.
I'm Ashley Ford, and I don't have an essay.
Well,
I'm just kind of ambitious.
Yeah. So Ashley was supposed to moderate this, but I ended up coming to New York. So Ashley has a long roster of accomplishments and is just a fabulous presence, and we're just all going to have this conversation. So let me get my cheat sheet out. So I guess I'll start just with a kind of a quick introduction about the project. People, ask you why did you do this book? And I keep trying to figure out the very best elevator pitch, but I haven't completely figured it out. I just had this sense in my own life. I had some successes and I had some failures, and I felt a constant yearning. I felt compelled to be goal-oriented, and then sort of a weird other experience of feeling judgmental of myself and repelled in a certain way by my own ambition, to the point where it started to get a little bit paralyzing. And then when I would bring it up, I realized that other people felt similarly, and it started to seem like there was more to this issue than just, you can do it, women can do anything. It was actually, there were two sort of competing narratives going on. Yes, you can do it, but you should do it this way, and this is ugly, and this is unappealing, and this is, you're not doing it right, or, of course you failed because you bit off more than you could chew, just lots of stuff. And so I had the idea one day, and then I asked someone if they were interested, and they said yes to write an essay, and then I felt committed because I asked somebody else. It grew from there. And then, interestingly, I think only in the process of doing the book did I come to any understanding of what all of those forces operating for women really are. And that understanding is really, really complicated because it's an endlessly complicated issue. So I feel grateful for the voices here tonight, which helped in that complicated understanding, and I also have never met a lot of these people, so it's exciting to be here in the flesh. And so I guess I'll just kick this off and ask my panelists why they think ambition is so difficult to discuss. Because one of the experiences I had when putting the book together was that women would say, I'd love to write on this issue, I'm going to do it. And then the next day they would say, I'm not sure I'm ambitious, actually. I'm lucky, and I'm really motivated, I serve my community. They would reframe it. They didn't want to say ambitious, and then we'd have to discuss that. And a lot of people actually couldn't write the essay in the end. I lost a lot of essays that way. And so that's my preamble to the question of why is it that it's so difficult to talk about? What do you guys think?
As one of the people whose essay she lost, true tea. I know she wasn't gonna put me out there, but don't worry, I'll put myself out there. As one of the people whose essay she's lost, I can say that one of the reasons that it's really hard to talk about ambition or write about ambition, I've gotten better at it since then, out of necessity. But it was initially really challenging because it is sort of that ambition sounds like an ownership sometimes that I don't think a lot of people necessarily, a lot of women, men always think they earned it, but that a lot of women don't necessarily think that they are worthy of. And there's I think sometimes there's this difference between the words deserve and worthy. I think you can convince a woman sometimes that she deserves a promotion, that she deserves a raise, that she deserves these things. It is so much trickier to convince a lot of women that they are worthy of it. And that is sort of the fake it till you make it part of being able to do something like talk about ambition in a real way. And if you can't, and you sort of, it's weird because I feel like what probably happened is that you introduced it and they were like, yeah, ambition, a word, a theme, I can run with a theme. And then, or at least this is me. But, you know, it's a theme, I can run with a theme, I'm a professional writer, I can do that. And then you stop and you really think about it and you think about your life and you keep thinking about everything you've accomplished, how you would actually ascribe it to someone else's influence or someone else's help. Or, you know, I think women have like this collective thinking sometimes where it's like, I don't ever want to pretend I got here on my own, not just because like maybe that isn't necessarily true, but also because we have this really narrow male-centric definition of ambition that sounds kind of cutthroat, and it sounds kind of ruthless, and it sounds like all of those things. And if you didn't succeed in that way, you start thinking, well shit, maybe that doesn't actually apply to me.
I mean, I think I had really negative associations with the word ambition when you contacted me, but I thought, well, I should really interrogate this. Why do I feel so negative about it? Is it because I was raised in an Irish Catholic family and you're supposed to keep your head down, and if your head went too high, it was, you know, you had to get smacked down, or the wrath of, it wasn't necessarily the Lord, but the world would kind of devolve on you if you owned your own ambition. And I think, I mean, I was so fascinated to see Hillary Clinton finally come out of hiding the past couple of weeks and give that interview in which she said, I was so struck by this, she said, I had high popularity ratings when I was Secretary of State because a man asked me to do the job. And, but I had low popularity as a candidate because no one asked me to run for president. No man asked me to, I did it because of my own ambition. And I really feel like there's this Lady Macbeth association with women and ambition that I think goes back to desire and women and desire and women being transparent about having desire. And I think just as your title proclaims, it's really a double bind. And when I was writing the essay, my husband, actually who's a psychiatrist, was pressing me on it a little bit about my negative associations with it and saying, you're not ambitious? You are a liar. And he wanted me to look at it. He said, how could you have written this many plays without having an ounce of ambition? So in a way that sounds so, it's so ironic that it's my feminist husband who is pushing me to own that desire and that ambition. But I ended up writing to my mother in the book because she had been feeling sad about what she said it was a lack of mission in her life. And I said, well, what? You were always working, you were teaching, you were acting, why does that not seem coherent to you? So I ended up writing her a letter about mission and how that's contained in the word ambition. And then to my daughters, who are 7 and 11, about what ambition might mean for women when they're grown up.
I'm maybe I'm a little older than you guys. I'm like 51, and I grew up with my parents sort of really being from the 50s with pretty strict gender roles. And the word I heard a lot when I was younger was like ladylike, as in that's not being ladylike. So I got messages, like overt messages, a lot growing up that I needed to tone it down because I was a girl. I mean, it was, it wasn't clandestine. And you talk about linking it with desire, and it makes me think about libido and about testosterone. I mean, a lot of people don't know or don't talk about the fact that women have testosterone. Women have desire, and there's certain times in their cycle where they have really high levels of testosterone, high levels of desire, and those sort of correlate with times when you've got a little bit more of a vector and a drive. And then, when you're kind of PMSy and don't really feel like getting out of bed, there's not much drive, there's not much desire, and there's not much testosterone either. So I think I may have been sort of a high testosterone kid or something, because I was achieving and proud of my achievements, and then sort of getting told to not be proud of my achievements. And I learned to couch, I learned to be less sure of what I was saying, and I learned to hide my drive more. to some degree. But to me, there's this sort of suppression of yin energy and this, pushing down of female power. That we're supposed to be subservient and not powerful. And I think for a long time, men have been encouraged to suppress their yin energy. But now women are getting that too. And that we're now, I think it's a little bit different, in that maybe there's more. That it's okay. We're encouraged now to have more drive and to have more of a vector. I think this generation, my daughter, I think is much more comfortable with ambition and drive than I ever was. So I feel sort of hopeful for the next generation. But I do worry about this whole suppression of yin and sensitivity that, it used to be that little boys were told, stop crying, stop acting like a girl, but I feel now women are getting that message, that we're supposed to stop crying, we're supposed to stop acting like little girls, we're supposed to man up. And I think that that's really dangerous because there's such an imbalance, I think, of yang in our culture. And I don't know if I really wrote about that.
Yeah, you wrote about that some. It's in there.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. When you wrote that essay, I was reading, I read a few drafts of that essay, and I too was like, yeah, testosterone. I must have had that too. I must have had a testosterone heavy girl, I think. Because, I did it. But I think it's more acceptable also when you're young. I think at least
when you're really young.
When you're really young. And I think for me, you have moxie or you're precocious until you're kind of like the Hillary Clinton, until you're kind of out there on your own trying to do stuff and you're older, and then it's a little bit it's not precocious anymore, it's just driven. And that can be more complicated. I think that I had my first feelings of that it was a little bit more complicated than I thought, probably in college, and then significantly more later after I left.
Well, I guess from my perspective, I didn't really have an issue with writing about this topic. It didn't seem that challenging for me because my parents are both immigrants. They're both academics. They came to this country in order to study, and it was just presumed that I would be very ambitious in that way, at least in a very structured status quo sort of way. So it was a sort of unspoken expectation that I absorbed and I suppose ran with, but the problem is that you have to be careful in what direction you run with that. In my case, I ran to law school, and then I had to, turn the cruise ship around, so to speak. For me, it wasn't so much the problem of ambition, but the problem of misplaced ambition. And in terms of the sort of quote-unquote status quo aspirations that I had, it was very clear to me, or it became very clear to me, that my ambition would not sort of overcome the structural impediments. I'm not saying it's impossible, I know glass ceilings, etc. But it's not only, in that case, your ability and your talent and your focus and your drive, it's also, it's sort of some kind of, you have to deep down really want it for the right reasons in order to push long enough and hard enough in order to crack through. And if you don't want that, you're going to just sort of be middling in these sorts of more, I guess, structured industries like the law, like business, etc. That you have to have something like a burning passion to go along with all of these other things, which I didn't have. For me, ambition wasn't this thing that I had to wonder about because of my gender. It was more so that it's something that seemed to be thwarted in certain contexts because of my gender. It's more of a structural relationship to ambition that I had, as opposed to, and as opposed to having problematized it for myself emotionally. So.
Can you talk a little bit of one of the things there's many things I love about all of these essays, but one of the really striking parts of your essay was the thread about Condoleezza Rice. Can you just sort of go over that and tell people who haven't read it that anecdote? You know what I'm talking about? It's the one about what she said. Well, it's really what you said about what she said about Rumsfeld.
Oh, right. Okay, so at some point, she is, and Condoleezza Rice is walking through some kind of garden, I guess, in D.C. with Donald Rumsfeld, who she's having a lot of personal problems with, I suppose, or I guess who's not really listening to her in the conference room or whatever, and she's trying to find out, why are we having these issues, et cetera, et cetera. And at this point, I believe she's Secretary of State. So I don't know what he is at this point, but I know she's certainly someone who demands serious attention and respect. So he said, well, I can't quite put my finger on what the problem is. You're really bright and committed. And she's thinking to herself, she wrote this in her autobiography, Bright. Why, how, at what point, I guess she didn't say much after that, but I guess the issue is at what point, are you going to be in and of yourself worthy of the position that you attain as a woman, as a person of color, without having somebody essentially pat you on the head and tell you how good you're doing. So I think that's what I was getting at.
And I think the other very interesting piece that you bring up in that sort of puzzle, and I think it speaks also to what Sarah brought up about Hillary Clinton, is the difference between you can study, you can be ambitious, you can learn all of these things, you can work really hard, but there's some level of power where you don't have to know all of those things. It's much easier for you to, so you were sort of talking about the law firm, but also Bush's presidency, where how do you get, can you really break through and become a person who doesn't need to know? Or is that actually where the ceiling is that has not yet been broken? I don't know how to talk about it in a better way, if you want to speak to that at all.
Well, in the other anecdote in the essay, George W. Bush and Condoleezza, I think they're hiking somewhere in the Eastern Europe, and Condi's going on and on about all her knowledge about Russia. She's very intelligent, she knows a lot of things about Russia, and she's really impressing them. And George W. Bush looks at her and he thinks, you know what, I really need to have her in my cabinet. She should be on my team, she knows a lot. Meanwhile, this is George W. Bush, who, as we know, doesn't really know very much. And we currently have a president who knows even less. So you have to wonder, structurally again, how does a George W. Bush, how does a Donald Trump attain seemingly effortlessly these high positions of power without really having to demonstrate competency, intelligence? Yeah, we know why. Yeah, exactly. We know why. It's it's a question that doesn't need to be answered. But at the same time, what's more interesting to me is when you look at a Condoleezza Rice and look at how much she knows and how much, she's problematic, but I will say you can't quibble with her competency, so to speak. So you have this juxtaposition between this certain figure who can just sort of waltz into these places of power because it's just presumed that they should be there, and others who have to overwork and overachieve and then continue to have to prove to whomever that they belong there.
That they're bright.
That they're bright. Oh, you're so, Condoleezza Rice, bright, okay. So that's sort of what I was getting at in that piece, in that aspect of the piece.
To be fair, I feel like no matter what situation I'm in and no matter how accomplished I am when I walk into a room, if there is a white man in that room who is my age or older, he will speak to me like I'm his mentee. If I'm on the panel and he's in the audience, he will speak to me like he's giving me something that, I previously probably just couldn't fathom. But it happens in every instance, and I wonder, that is a thing that I think about often is, it's like I have to be confident in a way that's almost delusional. I do, I have to be, I have to be on my team more than anybody else is on my team, because when I go into certain spaces, when I have certain conversations, when I'm inevitably in a room, it's different in New York, but I grew up in Indiana. Okay, so when I was inevitably in a room chock full of white people, usually white men, it was sort of like this thing where it's I'm gonna have to go in here and learn not to be offended by people thinking I'm stupid, which is already a pressure point for me. But when I'm in those rooms, it's if I don't, I'm gonna be in an argument with every person in this room. because they're all going to talk to me, despite the fact that I'm on the panel, maybe I'm the person giving the talk that they came to see, they're still going to talk to me like, I bet you didn't know this.
And
It's going to happen.
There's no way to win that either.
No, there's not.
Like, because if you say like, thank you, I wouldn't have fathomed that without your valuable feedback, you're kind of a jerk. But if you let people do that too long enough, it's kind of corrosive.
Yeah. For me and for them, to be perfectly honest, like I'm more concerned with me, but it's also corrosive to them. Like I definitely think that you teach people how to treat people. And if you let somebody get away with a certain behavior over and over and over, you, in a way, are kind of teaching them that it's okay,
right, and
that it's right. At some point, you got to stick up for yourself, not just for you, but for the learning process of us all.
So how do you do it?
You know, I wanna just say one quick thing about that before I forget it, because my brain's like a sieve. This idea that we're enabling bad behavior, I think, is really important. I wrote an op-ed called like Medicating Women's Feelings. This idea that more and more women are taking antidepressants so that it's harder to cry, so that you feel a little bit more invulnerable, a little bit more resilient. But what that ends up doing in the workplace is that you're not as sensitive to people being dicks or, slighting you or being inappropriate. Like, I had a patient who called me wanting to go up on her meds because this terrible thing, her boss was being terrible, and I was like, you need to talk to your boss and confront him on his behavior. What you don't need to do is take more pills so you don't care.
Yeah.
So I don't like this idea of enabling anything.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I was like, the only way that I've thought of to do that is to be perfectly honest. When I give talks, I talk about it. Even if somebody just did it in the room, I'll talk about it. I don't name names all the time. If I have one virtue, it's patience. I'm really good about taking people aside and being like, why would you say something like that? And really listening to them and having the conversation and knowing that they're probably embarrassed, but also knowing that the embarrassment is good for them. My boyfriend is, a white dude from Indiana. And he will tell you any day of the week that everything he has learned in being a better man has come through embarrassment. He had to get embarrassed. Somebody had to make him really think about what he was doing or what he was saying, and he had to have his oh shit, that's not the person that I want to be moment in order to change. Now, some people are going to get defensive, some people are going to get weird, and that's when you got to protect yourself. That's when you got to protect your time, your space, your body, whatever it is, and you have to separate yourself from the conversation. But I've found, generally, a lot of people just don't know. They just don't know. And even though it is not my job to teach them, it's not my job to have that conversation, as a person who is blessed with the patience and the will to have it, I'm gonna do it as much as I can, because I like to think that if I have that conversation, that maybe they'll think twice before they do it to the woman or the black woman or the woman of color or the differently abled woman or the trans woman or whatever behind me. Maybe they will stop and think, if this person is in the same room I'm in, maybe they know the same amount of shit that I know to get into the room. Maybe.
I have a question for Julie. It's not written down, so it's just in my head from your comment about the woman who, that anecdote is in your essay about the woman who is kind of wanting more, she's getting more and more aggravated at work and she just wants more and more medication. And so what happens to the woman who confronts and then suffers the repercussions? Somebody confronts, you say what you're feeling, you confront the person who's getting in your way or being an asshole or whatever, and then you get the flack about confronting them. That's kind of gendered, where you're a bitch, you're strident, you're aggressive, you're this, you're that. So how do you counsel people to withstand the punishment or the sort of the punitive aspect of being that kind of outspoken advocate for themselves?
I don't, most of my patients are women, and these sorts of things do come up, and one thing that I actually really do talk about is like, at what point in your cycle can you have a calm conversation, assuming that you're free range and you're not taking hormones. There are going to be certain points in your cycle where it really is easier for you to have these tough conversations. Shonda Rhimes talks about, like, have the hard conversation. I encourage people to have the hard conversation. You're doing that. One thing that I tell my patients is to say in your mind over and over that this person, your boss, is not your father, is not your mother, is just like another wounded child or whatever. But I think I think a lot of I'm going to be gender stereotyping now and say that for me and my patients, these are women who have men in positions above them, and so they end up having father issues and things like that. And so it's important to remember, that you may have, that you may get emotional and start crying. Like, one thing that happens with women is that they don't just cry when they're sad. They cry when they're pissed off. They cry when they're frustrated. They cry when they've been completely disregarded, and whatever the female version of emasculated is. So there's a lot of situations, and the problem is that when you're emotional, when you're crying, you can't speak. So that's one sort of nice thing, I guess, about being on antidepressant is that, you don't get so choked up and you can communicate a little better. But I honestly encourage people to put things in writing, to write emails, to write letters, because then there's a paper trail, and if something is inappropriate, you force them to write back, and as opposed to like having a one-on-one conversation where they can be total dicks and then you have no recourse. I do encourage. And I also think the nice thing about email is that even if you're really, really upset, you can still communicate because it's through your fingers. You're not muted.
Can I ask a question about email? Just because I was so intrigued by your essay, Robin, Robin had an essay called Reply All, where she unfortunately saw emails that weren't intended for her about women and ambition, but also about invisible forces to do with maternity leave, and how people are actually reacting to those negotiations behind your back. I just wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I had the unfortunate experience of, I had been offered a job, and the job started like 3 days after my due date of a baby that I was trying to have for like 6 years, and so the whole thing was just this, and it was a job that I really would have liked to have taken. And so I was trying to work it out. I was trying to figure out if there really was a way to honor motherhood and to take this position. And I was honoring motherhood was very important to me because I had worked really hard for the baby. And so with the negotiations, to make a long story short, we were in the middle of having them, and I had asked for lowered pay for more flexibility, and it pissed off one of the people on the search committee, and he wrote a pretty nasty email that accused me of thinking the job was a buffet, and I had mentioned that I had a book coming out. I thought it would be an academic job. I thought that would be like appealing to the dean, and he, I think, felt like I was bragging about my book, and it was on gender, and like, did I think just because I was writing a book on gender that I could play the gender card, it was that sort of, it was just this whole kind of brew of yuckiness. And I don't know what possessed him to put me on it was a reply all, I had written, we were negotiating, I was trying to explain what I was asking, how much of a reduced load I was asking for, and what duties I was asking to be relieved of in exchange for the lower pay. And it reminded me of a time when I was much younger that the same thing had happened to me. I was an investigator in San Francisco doing civil rights investigations, and I was really, really good at the job. I was getting all these great numbers, and I had outperformed the legal department in settlements one quarter, and I think that had made the head guy kind of irritated. And so, they were, I don't remember what the email was about, but he had said wow, our numbers are great, but her assertiveness is off-putting or something like that. And I remember thinking he was such an asshole. But, and it was a civil rights job, for some reason. It was so ridiculous.
So distasteful.
So you've got to be kidding me. This is the EEOC. And so yeah, the essay is just kind of about those two experiences of you don't actually usually get to sit in those rooms where people are shitting on you. They shit on you and then they come out and smile at you and say we've talked about it with the dean, but we're not going to give you. And so to see that like it's kind of funny to ask for less pay and get that kind of a response. It doesn't matter. It was the I think the reaction was to the sort of the brazenness of trying to work it out.
The brazenness of wanting both.
Yeah.
The brazenness of wanting to be a mother and work.
Yeah. And of really wanting to be a mother, of not wanting to like have a baby and then never see that baby for 6 months, but wanting to also do work I felt passionate about, to try, and there were lots of things that made it complicated to do this job with this baby. It wasn't great, and I didn't actually know that it was going to be successful, but I also wasn't expecting that kind of negativity to come back at me. That was really shocking. The failure of the negotiation wasn't shocking. So yeah, I mean that's a whole other. I was struck too actually when you were talking about. Well, you were in the green room saying that you had had an interview with Sheryl Sandberg, and I read Lean In preparation for this. And one of the things that I really remember from reading Lean In is the part where she talks about how to get a raise if you're a woman. Has anyone read that book?
How do you get a raise?
So she says, like, don't go in the room and say, I really feel like I deserve a raise. Because women, when they do that, they just look like they're out for themselves, and that is not an appealing feminist trait. So it's better to go in and say, women are traditionally paid 60% of what men are paid in this job. I've done my homework, and that appears to be true. So on behalf of all women, I'm asking for a raise. And so, so you're like aligning yourself, you're aligning yourself with everybody else, so you look selfless and maternal in a certain way, and not,
wow.
and not, like you're out for your own ego or pride, or you want your success recognized.
It kind of reminds me of this tend and befriend thing that I wrote about, which is about women with oxytocin. Like with a man, if you stress him, he will either fight or run away or freeze. But women do this thing called tend and befriend, where we kind of huddle together, and we're stronger when we're all together. We'll groom each other. So it sort of sounds like that's her advice, is that women only can really function well and in numbers. One of you isn't enough.
Well,
you have to do it to be everyone.
I think she would say has nothing to do with whether or not you really give a crap about what other women are paid. It's just that you need to appear to be out for everyone and not out for yourself.
You can't be self-serving.
You can't be self-serving. And maybe it's because traditional. I don't know. The reasons for that are very complicated, I'm sure. But
what did she say?
Well, our interview was actually about her new book, Option B, which is mostly about grief. But even then, she was talking a lot about the collective grief and also community resilience and things like that. We're going to talk about it. She's great. But she'll also tell you that a lot of stuff that she wrote in Lean In, now, she'll be like, yeah. There are parts that I just I didn't think that through, or now I have more perspective, or whatever. She is not, in my opinion, the interviews that I've read and even talking to her today, she's not doubling down on that stuff.
Well, that's nice.
There's a lot of it that she's yeah, that didn't turn out like I thought it was going to turn, you know what I mean? So yeah,
I liked Lean In. I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff in it. That particularly stuck because I have had the experience of asking for money and been in negotiations, and it is tricky.
Right.
Where you can feel it becoming tricky as you're sitting there in the room. It's a little hard to put your finger on why, but women going in and asking for raises and asking for money, it's just always a little tricky.
I've been very lucky, and then I think there is, a little something about my personality that makes people think that I'm just not going to take shit, and that I've done my homework. And so they'll be like, we'll offer you this, and I'll be like, that is way too high. But yeah, no, I'll take it. You know what I mean? Or I'll ask for more. Just because it's well, if you threw a number out first, then I got to ask for more. That's how I negotiate. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is tricky, and I've been really lucky that for the past probably 5 years, any boss I've had or any situation I had where I needed to negotiate, I was either doing that with a woman or an extremely feminist man. Like those are the circumstances that I've been in. But I know just from talking with friends and things like that that is not what's happening with a lot of people. I'm also on the coast. You know, like I live in New York now. I'm literally on the phone with friends of mine in Indiana, coaching them through negotiations with bosses who have very traditional views. You know, bosses who are saying things like, "But aren't you married? Like, why do you need a raise? Doesn't your husband?"
Oh,
you know what I
that's
mean?
true.
Like, but that's a thing. You know, I just wrote a piece it just came out Friday for my job about millennial women who are breadwinners and how they feel about that and the perceptions around that. And when I did the survey for that piece, I surveyed 130 women from all over the country. Like, they are not concentrated on the coast. There are women that are from Kansas and Montana and Wisconsin and Indiana, like everywhere. And most of them, it's complicated. And it's complicated not because they think their husbands or their partners or whatever should make more than they do. It's because while the women make more and maybe even work more, they still come home and do the majority of the work around the house. And one of the things that they don't get that typically a male breadwinner gets is that a male breadwinner, it's still a social status. It's still a thing to be like, my wife doesn't work and she doesn't have to. My spouse, my partner, whoever doesn't work and she doesn't have to. But when you're a woman and you're like, my husband doesn't work and he doesn't have to, it's like people look at you like, are you crazy? You are being taken advantage of. What do you mean? He needs to work. You know what I mean? A man that don't work. You know? And it's my dream that I wish my boyfriend would stop working. I wish he would stay home. No, I wish he would stay. He's a cleaner. He's a cooker. He's the most emotionally supportive person I've ever met in my life. I'm like, please just like, be home. Just be, so that I can come home and you're just there, like reading your books and with my dinner. Like, there's part of me that really wants that, and I know that like, it would kill his mother, first of all. And I know that like, it's just like, it's a thing that I don't know that we would ever be as counterculture as we can be, as non-traditional as we can be. I just don't know that if that's a thing you want to face every day. It's hard as a woman if every day you have to, and then people are like, well, is he at least a stay-at-home dad? And you're like, no, we don't have kids. Like that, it's just not gonna fly. People are going to look at you differently, and they're gonna look at you a little bit like you're dumb, and like you're missing out on something because you haven't adhered to this traditional gender role.
Oh, okay, well, if we're almost done, can I ask what to do my last? Okay.
I'm sorry, I talked.
No, it's not. I'm gonna ask my final thing. But I just want to bring up that this leads us also, and maybe the audience can take it from here, this idea of ambition within a marriage was one of the things we didn't really cover in Double Bind, because nobody would write about it, because it's like so fraught, and as I was saying to them, I think you have to be divorced to write about it, or a widow, yeah, whatever, but I think it's a tricky topic for a lot of reasons. But the last question that I want to pose is both Julie and Sarah in their essays suggest in some way, shape, or form, at least a thought experiment on what a feminist sort of reinterpretation of ambition might look like. And you brought it up a little bit too with the yin energy. Do you have thoughts on that? Like, is one of the reasons ambition is such a complicated thing to talk about because it's a thing made what it is by men, and do we need to does it actually need to change for it to be a satisfying facet of women's lives?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, answer that one quickly, Sarah.
Let me see if I wrote something down about it. So what I wrote to my daughters. Well, let me see if I can just dive in at the end of it. Girls, do you remember the time when one of you was watching the other play soccer? Anna, your team was demolishing the other team. The other team seemed to have no one cheering for them on the sideline, so at one point I cheered for the other team because I felt bad for them. Good block, I said. Hope, you were on my lap watching your big sister play. Hope, you turned to me with rage and said, why aren't you cheering for my sister? I am, I said. Your brow darkened and you said, then why did you say good block? I want to print t-shirts now that say, why aren't you cheering for my sister? It seems incredibly relevant post-election. So focused were you on cheering for your own sister that my cheering for another team produced rage. Is ambition always predicated on competition, and what does it mean to cheer for our sister, and even on occasion to cheer for the other team? Maybe it's not enough to tell our daughters to be ambitious. We need to define ambition to include love. This new definition might have a new spelling, ambition. Ambition might include love for the world, love for work, love for our sisters, love for others. If ambition includes love, then daughters, I hope that you do not fear ambition, that you do not see ambition as something that eclipses mission, that you see ambition as a mindful, skillful way of making concrete a mission you have found. So, I mean, for some reason, my friend who I talked about ambition really broke down for me this idea that the word mission is contained in it. Which you were talking about too, this idea that if you haven't found that passion and that mission, all the rest of it can become noise or become irrelevant or can become sort of not the point.
Well, I guess, I don't know if this is necessarily a feminine perspective on ambition, but in terms of looking at ambition that's not focused on competition, I agree that it's going to have to be something that comes from the inside and is made real outside, as opposed to entering some playing field and trying to knock down whomever or advance against whomever and whatnot. And I know we have all of these parameters for measuring who's done better than whom in whatever category. But if you have that sense that you're enjoying the process of whatever it is you're doing, then those things are just sort of, they don't really matter as much. The award or the pat on the head and this and that. They're nice, but they should just be extra. So another thing, I was talking with a friend of mine about just ambition. This is after the book came out, and she made the point, which some of you probably seen a lot of self-help books, but I love this point anyway. That you have to make sure you don't lose who you are in the process of getting to where you're going. So I think the real, test of whether your ambition is moving in the right direction is that if you get to where you're going, on some level you still brought yourself along with you and you haven't morphed into some kind of monster.
You want to do Q&A? I love Q&A.
I was just wondering if any of you wanted to talk about failure, which is something that I'm sure is in the book. I haven't read it yet, but yeah, I guess as I was listening, I was just thinking about failure and how fear of failure, at least I know, has prevented me from giving myself permission to be ambitious. So yeah, if any of you want to speak to that, that'd be cool.
I typically don't believe in saying no to yourself before someone else says no to you. And when someone else says no to you, I think that's what we a lot of the time consider failure. But the thing about, or at least in my experience, and trust me, I've failed a ton of times. Oh God, so much. But I've never failed so badly that there was nothing else I could do. And to be perfectly honest, the things that I failed at, even the things that I really wanted, if I started writing something and it wasn't working and I felt like it failed, if I submitted something somewhere and it was rejected and I felt like that was a failure, there are other publications and there are other stories to tell, And maybe this is still a good story. Maybe I didn't start it the right way. Maybe my language is stunted right now. Maybe I'm not ready to write about it yet. I write nonfiction, and there are some times where there are things that I'm trying to write about because I'm this would make a good essay, but the truth is I'm not ready to write that essay emotionally or maybe even skill-wise. Maybe I don't have the skill to write this essay yet the way I want to write it. I think failure It is part of success. It's part of ambition. Nobody has ever reached some pinnacle of success without failing at some point. It doesn't exist. You won't find those stories, except maybe Beyonce. But we can't all be Beyonce. There can only be one.
I think one of the things inside of that question is why is it that we think we're supposed to be perfect and not fail? Which I do think is something that gets put on women more than it gets put on men. I don't think men feel like I have to be perfect at this in order to do it, whereas something about the way that women are raised and go into their lives makes them think that a failure is eternal and is a character flaw and is really, really bad and revealing in some fundamental way, when actually it's just exactly what actually, you can't get anywhere unless you fail. There's failure in everything. You can't be successful without failure.
Well, and I think my other question to you is sort of in whose eye is failure? How are you measuring failure? And that's something that's on my mind right now, because in the theater world, there's a whole brouhaha about the critics right now, and the New York Times, one critic left in a scandal, and everyone thought, oh, surely they'll take this opportunity to hire a woman or a person of color in the theater review section. Wouldn't that be great? And they didn't. They hired another white guy. And, you know, you can have a production that feels really successful to the audience, to the actors, to, you know, to an authentic experience you had being in the room, and then the paper of record doesn't understand it emotionally with a very gendered lens. And to me, that fills me with rage and despair, frankly, and makes me want to hide in a shed and not write another play, to feel like there's such a disconnect between the official record of events and one's own internal experience, one's own compass. So when I hear a question about failure, I think, well, who's using the word? You know, how are you measuring it, and how can you redirect towards your internal compass? Because until we change the external measures, which happens slowly over time, we have our own version of events.
You know, one thing I wrote about in my essay was this idea of like women having to sort of hide their ambition, and hide the, you know, you have to achieve without striving, never let them see you sweat. That because to really look like you've got this bold vector would make you too mannish, and I do think that's really ebbing away. I mean, I think that the times are changing, and you know, women are allowed to. I mean, except for Hillary, women are allowed to, you know, boldly go where men haven't gone, and I think that includes owning our ambition and being more comfortable with it.
So I'm still reading, haven't completed the book yet, but something that I keep coming back to as I read the book is I'm trying to understand how you define ambition. What is ambition? And the corollary to that, I'm wondering if somebody can talk about loss of ambition. If one has already identified themselves as ambitious, what does it mean to lose that?
I can talk about that. In my early stages of being a recovering lawyer, I sort of reveled in apathy. It just felt great to not want to do anything, and it was amazing, you know. And but I don't know. I'm just like responding in that way. I don't know what that brings to the discussion. But perhaps when you were talking about perfectionism, one term that came up with some of my colleagues was defensive perfectionism, because, you know, thinking about ambition as something that you use in an environment that is sort of constantly thwarting you in various ways, or advancing you in various ways depending on your identity, then it's exhausting to, you know, sort of channel that ambition with all of those sort of oppressive frameworks around you, right? So in some ways, apathy could be liberating. You know, it's like, I don't have to do anything. I don't have to respond to any emails. I don't have to look at a document. I don't have to do anything for a little while. It was great.
And I think, ambition is one piece of a person's life. It is not necessarily the defining piece. And I think lots of times these things shift around and you'll have a period of striving and a period of whatever. Apathy, motherhood, which I think you could say is a different kind of striving. I think one of the temptations is to say, I am ambitious, as though that is like who you are, when actually it is a piece of who you are, and pieces are always, shifting. And in terms of the definition of ambition was a real topic of conversation with all of the contributors, pretty much. I was on the phone a lot with yes, what is ambition? I am ambitious. What is it? And so I developed a way of thinking about it, but I didn't want to force I would tell people the way I was thinking about it, but I didn't want to force people to think about it in that way. But if it was helpful, I thought of it. I had read a book by psychologist M.F.A. It's called Necessary Dreams a number of years ago, and I think she has a lot of really useful ways of talking about what it is. If you're interested in the topic, I recommend her book. But she basically says something to the effect of, I can remember it off the top of my head, wanting to master a skill or something that is more than, wanting to master something that really takes mastery, not simply like losing 10 pounds or, walking to work more. Something that takes mastery that is recognized by the world, and then that because you're looking for that kind of mastery, it needs to be reinforced by the world. And she makes the argument that that's actually very complicated for women, is that you're trying to do something, and if you want to be a writer, it's really not enough to write a poem and show it to your mom, and your mom says, oh, that's really great. You have to write, and it has to be recognized by people who understand what you're doing. They reinforce you. That's actually good for your identity. It causes that kind of that helps you be confident and keep going. So it's kind of a moving definition, but I like that as it helps us get out of the ambition. I have an ambition to lose 10 pounds. No, you have a goal to lose 10 pounds. That's different from ambition. It narrows it a little.
I can't help but notice the word master and
Yeah.
mastery, which is so fraught with not only gender issues but racial issues.
Yeah,
What a terrible word. So you a slave to your ambition. It's terrible.
It's true. There's no way to really win this.
And I just want to get back to this idea of failure, because I don't know if I answered your question, but the whole thing about never, you can't look like you're striving and you never let them see you sweat. That is a way to sort of defend against failure, because you weren't overtly going after it anyway. You were covertly going after it. And I'm not saying that's the healthiest way to do things.
Other questions?
I have noticed, by the way, that word masterful
Mastery.
lately as I, squint at the New York Times arts page when it talks about men's productions and male directors.
Right.
Masterful is a word that's used for men's products, and I never, ever do I see it for a woman director.
Right.
Never, ever. She's competent. She is able to deal with pace, but never, ever is she masterful.
If you're black, it's also raw.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a word that they love to use for black people. Oh man, it was so raw. Or it's it's tough, because you'll see somebody create something over, something they've been working on, they've been interviewing, they've been doing research, it is an in-depth piece, and it finally comes out, and somebody's whoa, powerful. And it's what? That's your commentary? Powerful. You know what I mean? And it's really just it's this idea, I think sometimes, and I think it goes across gender, I think it also goes across race, that the people who have not experienced what you experience as a certain gender or as a certain race, when they feel even a hint of something that you have felt, they act like you've cracked open the world. And it's so strange because then the other half of the time they swear they know more than you about what it's like to be you. I can't tell you how many men have commented or like privately reached out to me, especially white men, to tell me that they love something that I wrote and that I really helped them see something from a different perspective as like a black person or as a woman, who are the same people that when I post an article or when I post an opinion about something that happens to black people or women all the time are like, can it really be that bad? You know, and it's like, really, how would you know? Like, yeah, I guess I could be making all this up, but how would you know if I was? It's extremely, like, it's interesting, and it baffles me that people sort of like take this, like, it's the mentor talk. It's like, you're not my mentor. You know who my mentor is? Roxanne Gay. You are not my mentor. But they talk to you like that all the time. Diminishes your work in a certain way, and they think they're complimenting you, which makes it worse.
Is Roxanne Gay actually your mentor? Or you just...
Yeah.
I love her.
She's awesome. We have the same agents, Maria.
My agent didn't come.
Maria's my agent.
Yeah, she's also probably, I'm like, she's also Robin's agent. Like, it's not
All
like...
right, a little bit of that.
Last question right here.
Yeah.
A lot of the essays that addressed mothers, the writers' mothers, I noticed that come up a lot. Do you think that women in particular think of ambition in reaction, either positively or negatively, to their mothers more than men to their fathers, or perhaps with a different quality?
Or women to their fathers and men to their mothers, yeah.
A little bit. My mom was just, I mean, she was a single parent with 4 kids. You know, when I went to college and did my FAFSA, I realized for the first time in my life that my mom had never made more than $32,000 a year, and that she had raised us all on that. And I mean, we never went hungry. You know what I mean? Like, I always had a new pair of shoes to go to school with for the year. I didn't get a new pair of shoes like some kids did, but I like, you know, we were good, in my opinion. And I think my idea of ambition, also my idea of feminism, is very much wrapped up in my mother. Because it's not a word I think she would use to identify herself, but everything she taught me and everything she believes is a feminist ideal. It's just not something that for her, it was just survival. It was just like, yeah, of course you better be able to do whatever you want to do because you really can't rely on men. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, she hoped I would find a partner who I could rely on, but it was not something that she encouraged me to count on. And, you know, my ambition in my home was encouraged, even when I think it scared her a little bit. She let me do a lot of things, and she let me have a lot of freedom. But, you know, on the other hand, my mom also says things to me like, I'm glad you have your partner. I'm glad you have Kelly, because now your life is like complete. Now that like you have somebody. And I'm like, well, all right, Mom.
Well, I wrote about my mom a little bit in my essay, and I mean, I also just wrote a play for her called For Peter Pan on her 70th birthday that I wrote for her as kind of a gift on her 70th birthday. She's an actress in Chicago, but she would always say, well, I never had a plan. You know, she would just act when people asked her to. Which again, you know, was that about ambition? Was that about thwarted ambition or not owning her own desire? I don't know, but at any rate, I wanted to try to play for her as a gift, and she's actually in it right now in Chicago, in this little theater. And I thought, will the world implode if I see my mother playing my mother? What will happen to reality?
Have you seen it?
Yes, I just saw it. She was great. It's coming to New York in the fall, and there will be an avatar playing my mother, because it felt a little too nepotistic to say, and you will do the New York premiere, even though you've never acted in New York. It wouldn't have made sense. But I think I've always felt keenly my mother's desire and the ways in which it was fulfilled or not fulfilled.
I don't think I wrote about my mother too much. I think I have much more father issues when it comes to ambition. But I mean, one thing that I did write about, because I was trying to sort of take the biological aspect of what I was writing about, and I talked about my mom in her post-menopausal years when she really kind of came into her own. And one thing that the chapter is a lot about, my chapter is estrogen sort of allowing women to be a little bit more accommodating as opposed to testosterone giving us more of a I keep using the word vector. I know it's, you know, I wrote about the male symbol, like the circle with the arrow, and this idea that like there's ambition is like an arrow, and I wrote about archery a little bit. But so when she was in her postmenopausal years, she really kind of came into her own. She got a different job. She went back to school. She went back to school, and then she got a different job, and she really sort of had this blossoming. And I'm sure that I took that in on some level, that she just, you know, sort of reimagined herself and recreated a whole different job for her. But I definitely got these sort of mixed messages from my dad, who, you know, wanted me to be great, but toned it down a little. You know, it's kind of back and forth thing. And that's, I think, I don't feel like I have as many mother issues around ambition as I do father issues.
The other thing I wrote in my essay that my mother used to say was, she said she used to pray to God, please let me get 100 on my test and be a nice person. That's great, right? There was this, you know, this bizarre little tangle, this bizarre little knot.
And if you get 100, don't brag about it. I mean, I remember really getting shot down because I was excited about this great score I got. And my teacher like pulled me aside. He was like, you can't be proud of yourself, basically, you know?
Speaking of grading, I mean, not that, but I flashed when you were talking about negotiations for raises and this idea of women and worth and what we deserve. I remember so clearly, freshman year, Chad Robbins got an 89 on this history test, or he got an 89 final score. I got an 89.5. He goes in to talk to Blossom Marmel, the teacher, and tell her how worthy he is really of getting an A in the class, based on the 89 because of all the hard work he put into it. He's a lawyer now. And I would never have stooped to such a thing. I would never have said that I would never have admitted to the desire, nor would I have felt worthy to make a case for myself that was independent of an external measure. And I feel like we saw a little bit of that gender dynamic in the election, with Hillary Clinton kind of saying, look at my credentials. Jesus Christ, look at them. Really objective. And then Donald Trump being like, you know, I just walking in and kind of claiming in this atavistic way what he felt was his birthright.
Well, that's the difference between worthy and entitled, right there.
Yes.
I didn't really have any issues with like my dad. My dad was in prison the whole time that I was. My dad was in prison. He went to prison when I was like 3 months old, and he just got out this past November. But he's like sent me letters my whole life, and his letters were always just like, "You're the best thing in the world. You're my favorite person in the world, and I love you so much. And never forget that you're loved, and you're brilliant, and everything you do makes me proud." You know what I mean? Like my dad. I mean, he was in fucking prison, so he was like, "Go, go." You know what I mean? Like he was like, "Move on, move forward." You know, like get away from everything that you know might potentially have you end up where I am. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, like for a long time, I felt like my dad was my ambition. Like he was my self-esteem. The letters that I had from him were, you know, like a lot of people's parents tell them they could do anything, you know, but I had it in writing. And it was there for me whenever I needed it. And so a lot of my childhood was me, you know, like really and truly feeling like I had no reason to ever believe that I couldn't do exactly what I wanted to do. Nobody was giving me reason to believe that I couldn't, you know? Now there are some things it's like, sometimes you need the opposite. You need examples to see what you can do. You know, for a long time in my youth, I was like, oh, I'm gonna grow up to be an actress or I'm gonna be Oprah. Like, that's what I can see, that's what I'm gonna be. Every other black woman they teach you about is like in the civil rights movement, and so you're like, well, I guess I could try to sit on the back of the bus and see what happens, you know what I mean? But I think we're beyond that. Who knows what happens in the future, you know, maybe those lessons will come in handy. But when I was growing up, it was like, you know, those were the black women that you learned about. You did not necessarily learn about contemporary black women who were doctors, who were even lawyers, you didn't even see black women, like I grew up in the church, and you didn't even see black women who were preachers. You know what I mean? Like there was just this lack of opportunity. If you didn't see it on TV, then you had no idea whether or not it actually existed. And the people who had those jobs on TV, the black women, were still actresses, pretending to have those positions, except for Oprah. So it's like, what are you gonna be? Are you gonna be an actress or are you gonna be Oprah? And I thought those were my only options for a really long time, you know, and it actually was, to be perfectly honest, it was Roxanne, reading her work, her fiction work when I was in college, that was like, oh shit, like, and she lived in the Midwest, and she was a black woman who was writing like this, and I was like, what the fuck, like I can do this? But, you know, that's the other side of it sometimes with ambition. It's like even when you have it, growing up as a girl, and especially growing up as a girl from like a marginalized background of any kind of marginalization, sometimes it's not, you don't know where to put it. Like you have it, but you can't see really where it can go.
Because you don't have any role models.
Yeah, well, not really. Like you might have some role models for how to be like a good person, you know? I feel like I had those a lot. But there was no reason for me as a 17-year-old young woman to think that I could grow up and be a writer if I couldn't write like Maya Angelou or Toni Morrison.
Well, I have, like, if you want to stay another hour, I can tell you about my mother.
I have to charge you.
Julie and I are going to talk. I'm going to pay her for an hour.
Right, I actually got a cancellation tomorrow morning. I don't know when you're going to
I have so many more things to say because I learned so much from the women who wrote essays for the book. We really could. I wish I could have panels like every day this week with different people. They would all have something fascinating to say. It really was such an interesting ride to be in my position and to help people of so much talent try to articulate their stories. So I hope you'll read them. They're amazing. And thank you guys so much for doing this.